to start with a really brief sketch on what you're doing, why you're doing it.
Okay. You ready? Anytime? My name is Michael Merzenich. I'm a professor at the University of California at San Francisco. And there I have an integrative neuroscience laboratory. I'm interested in, you could say, complex processes of the brain. It relates to learning and remembering to thinking. And I've been very interested in the plastic processes that contribute to child development and to adult and lifelong learning, you could say. And I've been specifically interested in those processes that contribute to variations in human ability. To provide an explanation why one child might be clumsy and another agile, or one child might be a facile reader or facile in their language abilities or in their communication arts, and another child might struggle to read, might struggle to develop language, might struggle in their communication arts, and so forth. And then finally, I've been interested in developing strategies to use this incredibly powerful process of brain plasticity. The processes that underlie the evolution of functionality in a brain through learning and through experience. To command them, to control them, to master them, you could say, to drive correction in a brain insofar that that's possible in a child that's impaired or an adult that's impaired, an individual that's struggling, an individual that has difficulties. So I've been very motivated, you could say, to understand these processes on a level in which there could be some hope of driving true correction, true neurological correction. I'm not talking about necessarily substituting one function for another, or an end run around processes that are correctable. I'm talking about, insofar as possible, trying to drive true neurological correction in the brains of individuals that are struggling, have difficulty. And that's primarily what I'm motivated to do.
So you say neurological correction.
Right.
You need to create some kind of a contrived environment around a person that has a particular challenge that allows them to learn differently in relation to that in a way that will bring about some compensational change in their neurology? How would you describe that? Every
brain evolves in its ability to operate as a processor, as a receiver, as a user of information. And the explanation for, one of the main sources of an explanation for variations in human ability is how inherited weakness or differences of environmental experience contribute to differences of how the brain passes through those progressions. So if I think of the development of something like the language abilities of a child or the movement abilities of a child, if I look in any given child, I see a very idiosyncratic, a very individualized progression in detail. As the child, you can think of it in terms of movements, as the child going from the first wiggles to rolling over and sitting up and crawling and walking and standing, walking, running, jumping, ultimately be able to control very complex sequential behaviors, multiple movements simultaneously in the normal case. And it turns out if you look at any individual child, they go through that progression in a virtually idiosyncratic way, no two alike. Each child goes through its little progression in which you could say skill builds on skill, ability builds on ability. And ultimately you could say, well, if I went through that progression, maybe with inherited weakness, and ultimately I came to a point, let's say as a 5-year-old or 6-year-old or as a 10-year-old, where I had real limitations in my ability to control movement. To what extent could I, on the basis of understanding that progression that the child's gone through, could I know how to correct it insofar as correction was possible? How could I intervene to correct it right at its core so that I, in a sense, make up for the missing pieces, for the missing deficits, so that I can evolve in that child still the ability to control elaborate and agile movement? And I think in many instances that is the case, and that certainly is the target of what we try to do.
So this is analogous to the kind of somatic rehabilitation therapies that are out there in some ways.
You could say that it is, but a difference is that it's really based upon, insofar as we understand them, the neurological principles, the neurological progressions that we understand underlie these evolving skills.
So the intervention would be more ecological and more targeted to the kind of differentiation you're trying to get the brain to do.
It's very specifically neuroscience-based, you could say, and in consideration of how different progressions lead to different outcomes, it's very deeply concerned with the different scenarios, you could say, that could play out in different individual brains, that is to say, in different individual children. And basically how you would go back into such a brain and drive a true correction.
So this is requiring you to develop a number of unique assessments to be able to identify where these intervention points might be?
Well, in some instances, in some classes of problems that children have, there are very strong commonalities. That is to say that you can look at it statistically. Every child that has a language impairment does not have it for identical reasons, and in detail, in the surface detail, it will have many different expressions. On the other hand, the faults that underlie the development of a defective language representation in the brain that limits operations of memory and thinking and usage of language have much in common in the great majority of children that have such an impairment. So there are fundamental aspects that are seen over and over and over again in children that have such impairments. And those can be attacked, those can be addressed. So on one level, there are these great common tools that you can use in a sense over and over and over again. And then on another level, there's all kinds of details that have to be worked on and worked with to drive those specific improvements and corrections that apply more individually, more idiosyncratically. So the most powerful approach is a combination, you could say, of the powerful general tool, hypothetically powerful general tool, and a whole variety of very specific targeted tools that basically fill in the details.
Let's get specific about the oral language universe you just described.
Right.
You said that underneath the surface variation that you might see in terms of what the detail of what
Right.
is that's going on in an individual child, there's certain commonly implicate things that
Right.
are being developed. What are some of those? And bridging off of that, how do those differ and how are they similar to the challenge of learning to read?
Well, let me give you a very simple example. If I look at the brain as a self-organizing machine, and I could say, what is the most common expected fault in self-organization of its processing abilities? A very common general fault in its self-organization are the signal-to-noise conditions under which it organizes its basic language representations. And the reason for that is that there are many inherited faults that would contribute to degrading the capacities of the brain as a signal receiver, or that would degrade or that would increase the conditions of noise that occur in an active brain. You could say that in any such brain, to the extent to which those inherited faults contribute such weakness, the brain's language is not going to be clear English. It's not going to be English or Spanish. It's going to be noisy English or noisy Spanish. And that's a very common expected fault. There must be, we know there are, variations of signal-to-noise conditions in the developing brain. And we know that the extent to which the processes in the brain are noisy, as the native language is acquired, the speech model that will apply to setting up the processor and developing a processor in all its elaboration will be constructed on the basis of that defective model. So that's an example of an inherited fault or class of inherited faults that would, in a sense, come down to a sort of final common pathway of weakness that we could expect to target with a specific class of training tools. When you look at children that have language impairments, you commonly see that their processor has been adapted or adjusted just as you would expect it to be adapted or adjusted if the language model were noisy. So to cite several specific pieces of evidence, look in the brain of a child at 6 months of age and look at how it responds to rapidly successive stimuli, or look at how it responds specifically to phonemic stimuli as it's creating its selective specific phonemic representations that characterize its native language. And you see that it's defective in exactly the right ways. It misses those pieces of the speech, you could say, and it's adjusted its processor exactly as you'd expect it to be adjusted if the problem is a problem of signal-to-noise and representation of the language. The second example, create a computational model of a self-organizing brain and say, what would it be in the self-organizing brain that would contribute to the specific defects you see in the language operations of the child? And how you create that model is by simply adding noise, by simply making the speech model noisy. I'll take a third example. A third example is to look in an animal and give an animal a history of a noisy brain and then see how it adjusts its processors, its processing machinery, how it sets its time constants, how it sets its space constants as it processes complex acoustic information. And it does it exactly the way the brain of a child does it, in ways that account for its defective speech listening. So there's actually very powerful evidence that at least in many children that are slow to learn language, the problem is a true delay in the development of the processing of their native language that leaves them with a defective language. And their process is actually idealized not for English or Spanish, but for noisy English or noisy Spanish. And it turns out that that defect, that limitation, is actually powerfully addressable plastically at any point later in life. You can see that in an animal, you can see that in a kid. So that's an example of, from the basis of understanding the neurology, of the failure modes of the self-organizing brain or machine, understanding and documenting the specific changes that occur in the brains of children that are struggling, you begin to see how what accounts for the struggle, begin to see what accounts specifically for their difficulties, but you also have great insights into how to potentially correct it. And that's basically the kind of strategy that we apply in looking for these specific scenarios that might account for a substantial general weakness in children that are struggling. Did that make sense at all?
It did to me. I want to switch angles to get your glare on this side of the camera, see if that helps us a bit.
You can actually create a speech model. You can first measure the time constant in a child or in an adult with this history, and you can create a speech model and say, well, if I represent speech by a processor that operates with this sampling rate, how clearly, how intelligible is it to a normal hearing individual? And for the majority of these children, it is very poorly intelligible, has very limited intelligibility. That's another way of saying that they're not extracting information from the speech input stream in the way a normal child is. Now, it turns out that that dimension, we've shown in many experiments, that dimension of sound representation is plastic. I can take you or a monkey or a rat or a child with such a problem or a normal child and improve it. In fact, I can not only improve it, if I can degrade it. I can change it positively or negatively. It's plastic. I can make such distinctions about such stimuli very important to the brain by controlling behavioral context, and generally I can drive improvements in it. When I do that, the speech is represented, you could say, in a clearer way. It's represented to the brain in a more salient form. And there are a variety of points of evidence that demonstrate that you do exactly that in such a child. Now you can look in the brain and you see the time constant is more normal. Now when you look in the brain, you see that the way the brain represents information is more powerful. It's representing it more coherently, sort of event by event, as the intrasyllabic information flows by. It's represented in higher fidelity. And then every operation the brain makes with it is enabled by that. In other words, for a memory system, if the information flowing into the brain is represented in a non-salient way, it means that the capacity of the brain to encode it, to record it, is degraded. If I refine it, if I strengthen it, I strengthen the capacity of the brain to record it reliably as a memory. So there are a whole series, you could say, of downstream, important and crucial downstream consequences that occur from having a clear signal in. This really goes back to the basic arguments that were made at the early era of the study of dyslexia by Isabel Lieberman and others, who argued that the fundamental problem is the degraded way in which the speech represents this crucial phonemic information. It is representing it in a fundamentally degraded way, but it's subject to refinement. You could say the engrams, or the stored representations of information that are the basis of remembering and using them, are in a fuzzy or degraded form, an old idea. And that's exactly what we believe is happening. And we believe it's happening because the speech model in such a brain is just not up to par. In the early life of a child, it's noisy. It's degraded. A brain that represents speech based upon a muffled model generates an ideal processor for processing muffled speech.
Yep. Good. Sometimes we use the analogy of a player piano, and that the code that we're reading with is analogous to the code written for the player piano.
Yeah.
And that ultimately it comes down to, do we have the right number of keys? Are they making the right distinct sounds?
Yeah.
Can be played together in chords?
Yeah.
Because if the piano keys are out of a tune. If there isn't the right number of keys distinct in the sound, the code's assuming to be played. All this ends up with muddle going on. Instead of some kind of clear assembled reality stream that mirrors or reflects the speech.
Yeah, that's a very nice analogy, and one of the ways to think about it is, and as psychologists and neuroscientists have thought about these problems for a long time, they've isolated the sort of sub-problems that apply to a dyslexic or language impaired child. So, for example, they might say in relation to a player-piano analogy, they might say, well, we will define this as a problem. A child might have a problem of syntax. That is to say, of reliably relating what sound belongs with what sound on an incoming speech stream and making all the correct sort of online assumptions and relationships. All of those relationships, all ways in which you use information that you're receiving is dependent upon signal quality. It's all dependent upon how sharply, how crisply, how strongly, how effectively, how reliably the brain represents little pieces of sound flowing in, you could say. And so if you have a fault at the bottom of this chain, then you have a problem with everything. Okay, and that's fundamentally what the problem is. Now, I want to just say one thing farther about this. In a sense, another way that people confuse themselves about this is that they truly do imagine that there can be a fault at the bottom of the chain without a fault everywhere. Or they imagine there could be a fault at the top of the chain without a fault at the bottom. This is wrong, because in fact, no part of a language system operates in isolation of any other part. Faults are shared, right? If you have a fault at the top, you have a fault at the bottom and vice versa.
They're co-implicated.
They're co-implicated. So there's a common argument that there can be truly a deficit in something like your ability to devolve a word into its sound parts and to recognize that it has those parts. But in fact, a brain that does that reliably and normally has adequate processing all across its operational system by necessity. And a brain that fails to do that reliably is expressing a problem of failure in operation of the brain all across its operational system. They're complexly interconnected top to bottom and bottom to top, and you cannot really think of them as operating in isolation. Fallacy.
So let's talk about, in the case of reading, which is our focus.
Right.
We're saying on top of all of this, which I still want to come back and open up a little
bit,
talk about the difference between what is a kind of genetically driven variation in this signal-to-noise distinction process that's developing in the brain, and how much, in your opinion, is the quality of the soundscape in the environment the child's developing in. I'm going to talk about that.
Right. Well, first of all, I want to say that every child that has a reading impairment does not have an identical genetic fault.
Now, I was talking about for right now, leave reading aside, just down into the development of the kind of sound distinctions that you were talking about there at the core of oral language facility, which is a kind of this nucleus that gets played by the code later in the reading thing. Put the reading aside, just down to the sound level processing. There's a variation in how well they're coming into sound processing. It's a core piece to understand before we go on to talk about reading. Relative to that variation, there's some of it that's just a genetic, structural, developmental difference. There's some of it that's an impoverished environment that just has insufficient distinctions going on in their interactions with their parents and their surroundings to draw out the kind of distinctions that we're talking about. What's your sense of that spectrum? The development
of human ability represents a complex interplay, but you could say, between your inherited resources and environmental influences. Your ability absolutely springs out of, you could say, the self-organization of your capacities as a product of your environment, given your inherited resources. And so you can't think of, both of them are absolutely crucial for you could say, we have this broad category that we can call normal development, which has a lot of slack, a lot of latitude in it, right? On the other hand, we have the capacity to get the most out of a brain, you could say, which means that the environment is as rich and positive as possible within reasonable terms, right? And then more can be got out of brains if the environment is rich and positive and has greater possibilities expressed. And so you can't there's been a sort of religion on one frame that we're sort of stuck with our inherited resources, right? And to some extent, of course, we are. It represents a source of limits to every one of us, every living human creature, in every individual human being. But at the same time, we have a tremendous capacity to modulate the outcomes given our inherited resources as a function of our individual experiences. And one of the complications of that is that there's a very poor understanding of what good is when we say what we need to do for the kid to advance the most in the most positive way, to have the most general positive benefit from it. So we're very confused about exactly what it is that the brain needs to get the most out of it, you could say, to make the best communicating, effective, ultimately the best reader and so forth. But given that aside, absolutely, environment makes an enormous difference. So for example, we can take rats, and other scientists have taken rats, and you can, in a wide variety of ways, enrich their environments. So you can train a rat with all kinds of complex sound and music and other things occurring in their life that are important to them. And you can demonstrate that their processing of sound in their brain is much more elaborate, much more powerful, much more detailed processing, much more complicated processing, much more selective. I can raise a rat under conditions in which particular classes of sound that have particular features of complication are really important to the rat. And the brain of that rat will be entirely different than the brain of a rat in which that is not the case. I can raise a rat in which I make the rat an expert in some particular domain of sound. Let's say I make the rat an expert at making fine distinctions about subtle changes in the loudnesses of sound. And I look into the brain of the rat and I see the machinery that relates to representing details of the loudnesses of sounds are beautifully overexpressed, beautifully elaborated in the rat, and so forth. So in all kinds of detailed ways, you can change the outcome as a function of the processing capacities of the brain, as a function of what the brain does, what its history is, what it's learned about, what its progressions are. Now, in our case, in the human case, the listening experience of the brain is overwhelmingly dominated by language experience. Language is a powerful, incredibly powerful experiential source in the average kid. A Dutch scientist counted the words that his child had heard by the time his child was 9 months of age. And he found the child had been in the presence of probably about 4.5 million words, of which about 500,000 had been spoken to the child. The child had actually had 500,000 words directed to him, of which about 50,000 were produced in highly exaggerated form, in parentese, where the parent is talking in baby talk to the baby, so the child maybe can follow the speech a little bit more clearly. That's before the child puts the meaning to the first word. That's massive experiential exposure. Now, you and I know families in which, at that same moment in time, a child may not have been in the presence, except maybe on the television, of 50,000 words. Does that make a difference? Very probably. Very probably makes a difference. And the more that the parents are interacting with the child, in a sense, the more that received speech means to the child, probably the greater value it has as a training signal. It will make a difference. Sound experience in a child will make a difference. But the way the processor of the brain will be set up will be largely dominated to specialize for the native language that the child is exposed to, because that sound exposure is so massive and so special in the history of learning in the child.
It's so central to everything they're listening for in order to pull themselves into their work.
Absolutely, and it becomes so quickly, massively rewarding. I mean, it has this wonderful aspect that it becomes a main source of reward for the child, moment by moment in time in life. And
this ties in with the anthropological evidence that our whole structure, throat, jaw, tongue, teeth, everything has been forced to come into language in a way over the past 100,000 years.
Well, one of the things that happens, of course, is that it's massively exercised. And because it's so massively exercised, of course, it's also in every individual life history, it's incredibly refined and specialized for that specific purpose. You're not just receiving, well, by the time you're 9 months of age, you're not talking very much. You're mostly talking in the phonemic and syllabic kind of way, but pretty soon, you're producing speech on a massive schedule. And that's also represents heavy motor exercise and sensory exercise for your face and pharynx and tongue and so forth.
All of which are participating in a somatic feedback bath
Right.
during the process of differentiation that's happening in the brain, which is part of what makes it significantly different than the subsequent thing with literacy.
Absolutely. But of course, when you get into reading, then you enter another great epoch of intense exercise and learning. That ultimately, and what is ultimately a massively practiced skill, almost unprecedented in human history and beyond language. It has almost no precedent.
When you say almost, what's even close?
Well, language itself, of course, you could say in a sense, you could say surpasses it, but beyond language, nothing.
According to an external set of instructions
beyond language and beyond aspects of movement behavior, movement control. I could imagine other things you do on a very heavy daily schedule that are pretty substantially perfected. But beyond that, nothing.
The other side of reading for the most part.
Yeah, and one of the really interesting things about reading is that it's an incredibly modern invention. Hey, you have a sound source. One of the really interesting things about reading is that it's an incredibly modern invention. I mean, in a sense, reading was invented by Gutenberg, you could say. I once heard Professor Gardner at Harvard make such a statement, and I've loved it ever since. Or you could say it was invented by the Swedish kings that for the first time required that every child in the kingdom must learn to read, and left the local preacher, the local minister, responsible for that. And that's a 17th century event, right? That's a relatively recent event. So, in fact, this incredibly heavy exercise that we are all engaged in, it involves intensive learning. I might say there is another thing in a modern life that approaches it in many children, and that's computer usage. And the facile use of a computer mouse and keyboard in ways that are, you could say, beyond reading in communication with the machine.
Very few people learn to use a computer that are fundamentally illiterate, not learning to read and communicate.
Well, that's true, but there is a class of individuals that are absolutely illiterate and can't read, and in fact are even mute, that are very facile computer users. I mean, we've done studies on autistic children. Yeah.
Coherent feedback for any kind of coded apparatus.
We've done. I just want to say one of the things that we've seen in autistic children who are mute and can't tell you anything about anything, is that if you have in your little computer training program information about how to manipulate the program by punching function keys or I mean, they quickly discover those, and the next thing you know, they're going racing around the computer. You can find very few, quote, normal children that have such facility. So it does not derive directly from reading.
No, but let's put it another way. Somebody that could physiologically be able to read, who can speak, who can hear language, who gets involved in reading, if they don't make it to reading, they have certain problems that are probably going to make it difficult for them to get involved in word processing. Absolutely. It's a great source of limitation to them in many ways.
Doesn't mean that their reasoning abilities aren't powerful or effective on the short term. In the long term, as we know, one of the tragedies about having these impairments enduring is that ultimately the measures of your cognitive abilities tend to move down in the direction of your reading abilities, and it represents a real source of limitation and frustration in a child that hopefully can be overcome. It's very important to try to overcome it if it's possible. That doesn't mean that every smart person is an effective reader. I've met, and you've met, a number of truly extraordinary people that can't read a lick. And so it's not strictly correlated with intelligence, as we know. And we see these incredible exceptions.
Yeah, one of the common things about most of the exceptions is they had enough strength of self to not get hurt by not being able to read.
Right. Well, to say they're not get hurt is one way to say it.
Psychologically hurt, not get so shame-averse to certain aspects of their mind.
I once asked a very prominent American, very successful individual, one of the 100 wealthiest Americans, you could say, why, given his great individual success, he felt that it was so important investing in in research in dyslexia was so important to him, why he cared so much. And it was clear immediately when the question was asked why he cared so much. He still felt the pain of self-identifying as a kid as a failure, and of perhaps that self-identification more than his good parents was still carried as a burden by him late in life.
Clearly triumphed over it.
He triumphed over it, absolutely.
Whereas there's, millions that have turned out
that don't. The prisons are full of them. Failure, the world of failure is full of them, as we know. People that never recover their self-esteem from those early failures.
Let's talk briefly about that affective dimension.
Right.
In your work as a neuroscientist, are you able to see the effect of affect on cognitive processes?
Absolutely, and so it's a main thing that we study. And as you know, there's a long history of its study in experimental psychology. When experimental psychologists began more than 100 years ago to ask what it is, what factors there are that control learning, that basically modulate it, that make it effective, that make it stronger, that vivify it. And this has been a great interest in psychology and a great interest in experimental neuroscience for ever since. And we know, for example, that if you learn under the right emotional conditions, you never forget. And the learning is very effective. A very simple sort of class of animal experiments is if you give a rat something he really desires or something it really hates, it doesn't take very many trials for the animal to learn a behavior. On the other hand, if you give it something that's just a little bit rewarding or just a little bit punishing, it can take 1,000 practice tries or 10,000 practice tries to get the point, right? So there are these powerful modulators of learning that apply in every older brain. One of the interesting things is that you don't come into the world with this. In the very first part of life, in what's called the critical period, the learning machinery is on continuously. It doesn't really care so much about how, quote, important the input is to the brain. It's got to change, and it changes just on the basis of being in the world. And you could call it, it's kind of a setup time where the basic form, the learning machinery, basically this modulatory control is just turned on. Learning switch is saving almost everything. And what happens as the brain evolves at the end of the critical period is the modulatory control comes in place. And now you learn most effectively, overwhelmingly, when you're paying attention and as a function of rewards and punishments that occur in the behavior and how bright and alert you are in the behavior. All of those things are critical contributors to how effectively you induce change in learning. We've studied this in a variety of ways, and hundreds of other scientists have studied this. One way that we've studied is to control the chemicals that modulates these processes one at a time. And what we've been very interested in is what they contribute, sort of process by process, to the changes that you witness in the brain as you learn. So that, for example, you can control the chemical that's primarily associated with a good outcome or reward, that's dopamine. And if you control it selectively, you generate one set of changes in the brain as you learn. Or you control a chemical that's primarily associated with learning under conditions of close attention. That's acetylcholine. That generates another set of changes in the brain and so forth. When you learn, you actually have nuances of change that are contributed by different aspects of the emotional state or content in learning. Now let's take a really big event. Kennedy was shot. Where were you? What happened? Most people that lived in that period would remember that. Man first on the moon 35 years ago. Where were you? Remember that? Most people will remember some things about that. Maybe the flag on the moon, maybe the first step, maybe the first phrase. I do. And we'll never forget it. And because all of those things were in play, all of those neuromodulators were in play. I was paying close attention. It was a highly rewarding experience. I was alert and bright as a brain can possibly be as a young man at that point. I'll say that in any such experience, in learning, in teaching, in the classroom, in anything you do in the brain, the most effective way to drive change is to have those conditions right and to control them.
Have you ever encountered Sylvan Tompkins?
No.
The affect theorist dealing with...
I know the name.
Okay, I know the name. One of the particular things that's interesting, in addition to thinking of affect as the channel that cognition is happening inside of,
Right.
that has these different biases,
Right.
interest,
Right.
fear, anger, so forth.
Right.
That this is itself a construction. Right? This is a neurobiological construction. This carrier wave or the attention channeling.
It's absolutely a construction. I mean, an example of that is to look at the sort of domain of rewards that would apply, let's say, of one individual versus another, right? What would one person find to be rewarding, and what would another person find to be rewarding? Okay, and what you'd see if you look beyond the most primitive things is fabulous elaboration. That's very individual. And you see big distortions, obviously, that can occur in one individual that don't apply at all in another individual, right?
What makes what relevant?
Right, and as you move through life, these become sort of more and more sort of idiosyncratically complicated. They're a big part of what your brain signals to you is important, and that's actually being created in your brain as you move, as the brain organizes itself across life.
Right.
So
one of the things that we're interested in that connects here is shame. In particular, what's happening, not just at the level where we could say, I feel ashamed of myself,
right.
but before that, pre-consciously before that, in the admix of affect that's powering and directing and channeling cognition, when a child starts to go into shame, what's happening to their cognitive bandwidth, cognitive processing bandwidth? And the sense is that there's this downward spiral that's starting to kick as the child starts to feel shame, and the shame itself starts to become more and more occupying of attention.
Right. Well, it's
and diminishing
right.
the cognitive bandwidth capacity available for processing what's going on.
It's a great point, and let me just say it's a wonderful thing to study, and that to some extent is being studied, but it's a wonderful thing to try to develop a deeper understanding of. And let me just say something about it, and that is that there's a sort of intuition that all of the change that occurs in these learning contexts is positive. That if I throw emotion on, I learn better, right? Not right. That's not correct, right? So let me cite a simple example. If I learn under conditions of incredibly high stress, I'm an extremely efficient immediate reactor to the situation at hand, but I'm not learning worth a damn. Obviously, if I go into a period of depression and I come out of it, I can't remember a damn thing that happened. I'm using a little bit of coarse language here. I can't remember a darn thing. Yeah, I can't remember a darn thing that happened, right? That occurred across that period. And actually, if you to cite an example of that in an experiment, if I put an electrode in the brain of a rat or a mouse, and I stimulate it, each time I have an experience, particular form of experience, so as to create a condition that would be just like very powerful activation of the brain systems that contribute to depression. What happens is that I generate an incredibly big positive exaggeration of that stimulus. It grows in the brain like a monster. Everything else is degraded. So here I'm growing something that you could say is like a great fear or a great obsession, and its power in the brain is growing and growing and growing. Everything else is degraded, okay? So there's a negative side, there's a dark side to what's happening, right? And so in neuromodulatory systems, they're not just contributing positive change. I'll give you another simple example. It was known since Pavlov that if I follow a stimulus with a reward, first the bell, then the meat, the dog salivates, right? Now I ring the bell and the dog salivates. That's called classical or Pavlovian conditioning, right? Well, let's flip it around. Let's give the meat, then the bell, okay? Then what happens? The answer is a peculiar form of unlearning. What happens is that now, if I flip them around, and now I have the bell and then the meat, the dog can't learn the relationship, okay? I have a negative effect that's occurring. When I look in the brain of a rat that has the same experience, I see a positive change occur when the bell precedes the meat, signaled by the release of this powerful neuromodulator. When I reverse them, I see exactly the opposite. The ability of the bell to excite the brain is erased. Okay, so I actually see a negative plastic consequence. So we think of this as being positive, it's not all positive, and we think of learning as being positive, it's not all positive. Another way to think about it is learning is selective. It's not just that you learn everything all the time. It's selective. It's a selective process. One great scientist, brain scientist, told me one time, this is Herbert Jaspers, who was a great scientist at the Research Institute in McGill in Montreal. He said, it's not so, I might say he told me this when he was about 90 years old. He said, as I was explaining to him the powers of the self-organizing brain, he said, never forget that when you're trying to get across town, it's not just a matter of what bus you get on. He said, it's all those buses that go by that you don't get on. He said, it's being able to sort out what's important in a complex array of things that are happening and they're arriving in your brain that you have to make distinctions about. The brain processes that govern the development of our behaviors are selective. Some things they operate on positively, some things they're suppressing, and they're operating on negatively.
Have you done anything to actually isolate shame? Any kind of signature of what shame looks like when it's triggering in the brain?
No. I thought about it primarily from the point, and read about it primarily from the point of, you could say it's kind of obverse, which is self-esteem or positive self-awareness or self-feeling, and haven't really thought about it. As you raise the issue, it's a wonderful thing to think about in the obverse. I've primarily thought and read about it in a sense in another thing that would reflect it, and that's the sort of ongoing loss of self-esteem, of self-confidence, of self-doubting, and what could be done about it.
I spent a lot of time in the self-esteem world before getting into the reading world. I'm in the reading world because of what's doing self-esteem. Although I don't like the term self-esteem, it's got a lot of bags with it.
It does, and it's confusing.
It's a buoyant absent of self-negativity in a way, rather
right.
than a positive accumulative.
Right, exactly. You can have a boy that's very self-confident, and yet, in a sense, identifies themselves in a broad domain as a failure. And in fact, that self-confidence can be a kind of compensation. Actually, what I've really been interested in is what you could call the origins of bad conduct behavior. Because I think it would be a tremendously positive thing if we could understand, and again, it relates to the development of emotional control and these complex reactions that occur in the brain that govern, in this overriding way, the general behavior of a child.
Well, the center of our action is this. We think that the children are being overwhelmed with a form of confusion that's unnatural to them.
Right.
And they are learning to associate the feeling of that confusion with shame.
Right.
We are all shame avoiders, escape artists.
Right.
We don't like to feel shame. And so as a consequence, we're learning, just as reading has to be an assembly that's faster than conscious, right? It is a faster than conscious aversion to shame, which is associated with the feeling of certain kinds of confusion, which has got to be decapitating to learning, because learning involves extending through confusion. Right,
right. No, I love that description. Although I don't really understand its neurology, I love the description.
I'd like to send you some links to some people's work on shame, and one of the things that we're trying to do is bring together some new exploration into what is the role of the negative affect triggering in the stream of cognitive processing.
Right.
It seems to me it's got to be disentraining.
Right.
Right?
I think
dissipative and disentraining.
I think it would be a great leap if you could understand. I mean, if you have a child that enters school and the child fails at school, which means that they're experiencing they're reacting in these ways to it, and if they're misbehaving, they have about an even money chance later in life to commit a felony. I mean, you might as well just shoot half of them at the outset, right? I mean, the simple fact is that we have to figure out how to get to those kids more reliably and more completely, and it doesn't necessarily involve cultural re-education exactly. I mean, we don't really know. If we could understand the neurology, the more deeply we could understand the neurology, the more we could understand how to drive true correction of it.
Unless the neurology embraces some kind of the interdynamics between the purely mechanical, more cognitive processes and the effectual processes that are orienting,
Right.
contextualizing, and powering, amplifying the
Right.
cognitive activity, we're not, I can't say we can get there.
Well, I don't know. I believe that all of these things are in some level accessible. Whether such training could be easily incorporated in a condition in which, under conditions of something like a public school, where an aspect of the training might include, in some sense, some level of social training, whether that's really necessary or not.
Well, it's also a matter of recontextualizing the kind of challenges that children are going into so as to be less provoking of a shame response.
Well, one of the ways that we've tried to design the software that we've applied to children, the training programs that we applied to children, is specifically to absolutely assure a high level of success in every kid. And this is a big part of it. A big part of it is to find ways through the course of every kid in a significant part of their life and day to assure that they succeed at things, right? I mean, one of the magic things that has to happen to every kid is they have to find something that they're good at, and everybody acknowledges, and everybody tells them, and they tell themselves. You know, I mean, even in those conditions, as long as you have enough of those things happening in your young life, you know, there can be the thing that you can accept someone else is better than you at, right?
And it can be the thing that I feel good about myself because I can beat up everybody around me.
Right.
Right? I mean,
Well, there is that.
That can lead to...
There is that. There is that. It has to be things that are outside of that realm.
Good. All right. I think we touched on all the pieces that I was most interested in this interview.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we've inspired in the course of our conversation that you think you'd like to touch on that we didn't?
Only to say that this is a great quest, and more and more we progress in understanding the neurological origins of things like this. And one of the crucial dimensions of this, as you express, is this relationship between the emotional side of life, or these overriding behavioral things that relate to neuromodulatory control and emotion. I mean, when you talk about neuromodulation and you talk about the things that condition effective learning, you're also talking about the overlay of emotional baggage that comes with them, that are expressed with them, but also derived from them. And you also talked about the fact that each one of us is basically creating the complex conditions under which those are constructed, and those inhabitate our heads and control our behaviors in our life. And one of the crucial things is to understand this complicated interplay and to understand how that evolves, how that is plastic. That's been studied almost not at all. People have studied the axis of neuromodulation. Dopamine cells and dopamine chemistry has been manipulated in hundreds of ways. Partly because people see that there's profit in it to manipulate it, because it's so clearly involved in so much malfunction and so much disease in psychiatry and in neurology. But still, almost nobody has studied in any detail or in any intelligent way how this capacity, how this control, how this incredibly differentiated nuances of emotional control as they influence learning and behavior are actually created and developed in an individual way, in an individual person. There's high stakes in such understanding. So one of the things I think is evolving and will gradually evolve is a level of science in that area that will parallel the level of science in learning as it relates to the sort of dry side of learning, and that's skill learning. And as that evolves, I think we're going to generate more and more powerful ways to intervene in real human problems.
That's excellent. And that's being echoed. I mean, Russ Whitehurst realizes that. That's a big weakness in the whole assessment and educational side. And other scientists that we're talking to also recognize that. That's this huge lacuna, this total loss of something that we're just beginning to understand is too significant to leave out of the equation.
Right.
Yeah.
Not just for kids, but in all of these other extensions.
Yeah.
It's a big thing of what we're trying to do in older individuals. I mean, we have a 70, 80, 90-year-old. This machinery is now, again, going to hell. And you have to think about how you can reinvigorate it, revitalize it, re-enrich it. You know, we have to people's attitudes can be better. The things that are rewarding to them can be stronger and more elaborate, and they should be. You know, that's part of being healthier and happier at an older age.
That there's an infrastructural, deep-level cognitive learning that's affecting how we're affecting cognition.
And
it's looping at such a deep level here.
And guess what emerges when you get older? Shame.
Yeah.
What emerges is a lack of confidence. I'm now worried about whether I can succeed, whether I can keep my end up, whether I can. I mean, all of these things enter in again in spades.
That's why I think it's so important that there is a biological basis for these core affects that are necessary. And shame seems to be, when we think about the human animal, a fundamental learning prompt, a really great thing. It's not taken to the wrong extremes. But if we become averse to the feeling of shame before it actually bubbles up for us to think about it, it's steering our thought away from what we need to learn about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that seems to be happening en masse.
Right. It just basically shuts you down. Well, anyway, that's what I have to say about these complicated things, and I hope it's useful.
It is. The kind of ambiguity that's involved in processing this code. I mean, everything else that we do, first of all, there's like we talked about earlier, there's this somatic feedback field, right? One system gets feedback from another system to kind of build connections with. I can feel ever more subtly as a child as I differentiate my motor control. I can feel the gesture of my face in articulating a certain sound. I can hear, after you've said it many times, I get the carrier wave of your affect informing one level of the meaning and my differentiation of the sound matching up with it. There's a lot going on. When I get to this reading thing, these letters are placeholders for a wide field of possible values that aren't resolvable in direct relationship with these letters, but rather have to be disambiguated inside the context of a field that I have to buffer up and work on all of this faster than I can possibly think about. Right.
The brain is incredibly good at making these almost real-time correlations, and it can do that does that with incredible power in your every action. I mean, you've just described evolving your sense of feeling. You could say as I control my movements. Well, in fact, you never actually do that, hardly ever. I mean, you can look at your operations in these modes in isolation, but nobody told the brain generally that you're looking and feeling in an operation, right? In fact, you're doing both, and maybe looking, feeling, talking, and smelling, or whatever, right? And actually, the brain is creating all of its constructs like this around this sort of ongoing active correlation, and it's incredibly good at it. So your face, your anterior face, and your tongue and your throat are becoming incredibly specialized as you speak. And people tend to think about it and they say, well, I'm speaking, and as I'm speaking, I'm listening to myself. In some sense, I'm correcting what well, just paralyze the sensations from your face and try to talk. You go to hell. You can't talk very clearly, right? And the reason you can't is because you have all of this unknown contribution and feedback to doing all of that production that you're not aware of. You're getting lots of feedback that's not listening at all. And in fact, it's pretty crucial to you being able to make all of that sound roll out. And that's all a tiny way of saying that when you do something like an active reading where you're making this ongoing translation between what you see and the brain's representation of the sound parts of words that you're associating, and then on a higher level, pretty soon you're looking at whole phrases, maybe even whole paragraphs, and you're just whipping it up, right? You're making those correlative associations in a powerful way, incredibly powerful way. But the machinery is made to do that. It's made to make ongoing correlations of that information and to make these elaborate constructs of it.
Whoa. The brain is made to do that.
That's it. That's a main.
That's generally capable of making these complex constructs the way that you're describing. But in terms of this code, I mean, as you said, it's 300 years old. We've talked to the people that are the experts in its origin in the 1400s with King Henry V and so forth and so on. When you look at it, there's 1,100 different ways, 26 letters make 44 sounds depending on the context, which can sometimes take a whole sentence to determine what the sound value is.
I think I said it was good at it, didn't I?
Yes.
You're just saying it's really, really good at it, right? I agree. I
And
concede.
It's incredibly good at it, and it's an incredibly unnatural challenge.
Right. Right. I agree.
And that for some children, for reasons connected to the auditory process we were talking about before, right?
Right.
Or
depends on what you call a natural challenge. If you think of what I do in my daily life, almost everything that I do, that's a well-developed skill that I have, did not necessarily exist even 1,000 years ago.
right?
Pick up a spoon. Where spoons are a recent invention. Grab that bottle and drink it. Whoever saw a bottle 1,000 years ago?
But the difference between manipulating a physical object, different that it is, and learning to process this code is I can feel this thing. I can name it. It stays a relatively stable object in my universe. When I'm looking at a letter, especially I'm 4 or 5 years old, I'm looking at a letter. It has all this.
But you see you're bringing some magic into it that I won't bring into it. And here's where I'll chop it out.
Good.
It's absolutely right that you have an incredible facile ability. So now I spend tens of millions, maybe several hundred million practice trials generating a facile representation of phonemic composition of syllables, the sound parts of words that I'm now going to represent by letters, and their syntax. Well, I got a magnificent representation of that. Now I'm coming into that with all of those resources. I got those incredibly stored and powerful and reliable resources in which I'm making all of that ongoing analysis, interpretation. It's all possible. Now, I don't start reading just lickety-split. I have to struggle. Reading is not automatic. I have to relate those letters to those sound parts. And let's start that, and let's spend a year or two, hundreds of thousands of practice trials before I'm really facile at that at all. And now I know what rhymes, what this rhymes and that rhymes. Now I know that this word has these sound parts, this word. I'm creating that reference library. And now I'm creating it, and now I'm gradually have another million or so practice trials, and I'm gradually getting it involved in elaborating it into my semantic dictionary, where I'm getting into the real syntactic elaboration and complexities of the real language. And I'm getting into the phrases and sentences, and in other words, this is an incredibly powerful, self-constructed brain.
Virtual reality.
Right. I mean, you got it. This does not just pop out of a brain, right? This is a product of massive learning.
100 million of us are not doing this very well.
Yeah, that's right.
Handling our lives.
Right.
And
absolutely.
The kind of confusions
Well,
associated with working these letters into.
I think what we're both saying really is that it's a miracle that it ever happens. It's an incredible human capacity. It's hard won by incredible depth of practice. It's very unsurprising that many people struggle with it. You wouldn't have to have much of a fault in this machine operating with high speed and this incredible processing efficiency that's required to begin to see somebody be a little slower at it or a lot slower at it. And so therefore, dyslexia in a self-organizing machine of this nature is an expected problem. It's an expected weakness. It should apply very widely.
Wouldn't the trouble be proportional or related to, in addition to the underlying sound processing engine that we talked about earlier,
right,
that the greater the confusion and the correspondence between letters and sounds and the amount of brain time it takes
oh yeah, absolutely,
the greater the stress on the system to produce the
make the representation of those sound parts of words a little fuzzy. And now I'm going to slow down the ability. And also, as soon as you do that, I might say you also have a decline in processing efficiency. The ability to hear something and rapidly translate, do anything with it, is slowed down.
Does it exactly apply to the fuzziness between letters and sounds?
Absolutely it does.
My point.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a technological artifact, not a naturally occurring soundscape.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, it is in a sense a technological artifact. Absolutely.
Okay.
That was, so I'm glad we got a little bit of animation there.